Hi, this is Jesper from Velocity Peak, and in today's X Particles and Cinema 4D tutorial, we're gonna make this. And we'll be using the new push apart modifier in the latest release of X Particles. And if you want to follow along, all project files are available on velocitypeak.com. Okay, let's jump in. Okay, so let's start. The scene has 180 frames, and then just some elements we can use later on for rendering. So let me bring in an X Particles system, and we'll be using the new push apart modifier in X Particles. And just a side note, at the time of this recording, this is an early access release, so you need to have access to the early access release to have this modifier. So the modifier that I'm talking about is under modifiers, motion modifiers, and then XP push apart. And let's change a few settings in the default emitter here. First of all, let's go to display and set this to circles so we can see the actual size of the particles. And then under emission, let's do shot, and just 1,000 on the first frame is good. No speed. And then let's change the object. Let's do a sphere, and let's do that 30 centimeters. So the push apart modifier is active. I'm gonna hit press play, and you can see it just works. This modifier just works straight out of the box. And if I look at the settings, it doesn't have a lot of settings. And they're pretty self-explanatory. So distance, for example, is the distance between each particle. And then the strength is obviously how strong this is. So if you want this to push apart slower, then you set a low strength. Set that back to 50. Now, one setting that's really important and that's really useful is the distance mode. Right now it's absolute, so everything is going to be pushed 10 centimeters apart from the next particle. But if we set this to particle radius, it's going to honor the size of the particles, and this is really powerful. Let's go back to the emitter, and under emission, let's bring in some variation for the radius. So right now it's 3. Let's do 3 for a variation. And that means that each particle can be anywhere in between 0 and 6. So now that I play this, we're going to get this, which is much more interesting, I think, when we have different sizes of the particles. So I also want to show you another common use case for this would be to get a circle packing look. So let's rewind. I'm going to emit from a plane to do this. So let's get a plane. And let's make it smaller, 200 by 200. And I don't need to see it, so let's Alt-click on these traffic lights. Let's go to the emitter. Under the Object tab, instead of an emitter shape of a sphere, let's do an object. And then we want to do the plane. Now, I'm going to hit play so you can see what it does. It's going to shoot straight up, which in itself is a kind of an interesting look. And I'm sure there'll be times when this is going to come in handy. But the circle packing look that I'm going for, we get when we go for polygon area, like so. So now it's just going to push part out like this. And I mean, imagine these were bubbles or something like that. And this looks quite nice. So I'm sure we'll see lots of examples of this. But that's not what our project is going to be about. I just wanted to show you this. It's a very useful modifier and easy to use. Okay, so let's delete this plane. Let's go back to the beginning. And to start this, I'm going to go to the MoGraph menu, and I'm going to get a MoText. Let's frame this a little better so we can see it. So I'm just going to type in C, a capital C. And I always like to align this to the middle. And a depth of 55. But certainly, let's change the font to, I'm going to do this one, Montserrat Black. And this is a free font. It's a free Google font, so you should be able to get it. Another thing that I want to do is I want to have a spline that goes in the middle of this C. And I'm going to use that spline to drive a spherical field later on. So to draw that, I'm going to go to the front view. So if I hit F4 on my keyboard, and let's get the pen tool. I'm going to start out here because I want the spherical field to start outside of the letter and then travel around like so. So let's start here. And I mean, this doesn't have to be perfect. Just follow the contours as best as you can. Something like that. And then somewhere here. And then I'm going to hit the escape key. And I'm going to select the spline and perhaps move a few of these points around ever so slightly. It's kind of easy to get stuck in a perfection mode here, which really isn't necessary for what this is supposed to be, just a rail spline, or just a spline, not a rail spline, technically. So I think that's good. Let's go to the perspective view, F1. And actually, one thing we need to do, we need to move this spline into the center of the object. So if I hit F2 for the top view, and I'm going to move the spline in the center. Now, the depth of the text is 55, so let's do 27.5. That'll be in the middle. Okay, let's go back to the perspective, F1. And I don't need to see the spline, so I'm going to Alt-click on the traffic lights. And I want to see the outline of the C, but I don't necessarily need to see the C. So what we can do is right-click and go to Render Tags, Display, and then if you do Use, we can just do Lines. So now we can see the C, but we don't see the body of it. So now let's go to the XP emitter and let's emit some particles. So under the Object tab, we are still, the emitter shape still going to be Object, but now let's get the mode text. And instead of emit from polygon area, I'm going to do Object Volume. And let's just see what we get. So it just works. So now this entire volume is filled up with particles. Now, this works if you want to have this filled up from the get-go, from the beginning, but I don't want that. I want to be able to control that with fields, with a spherical field later on, so we can have it fill up wherever we so choose. So instead of the emitter, if we go to the emission tab, instead of having a radius to begin with, I'm going to set this to 0. And if we play this back now, we get nothing because, well, the radius is 0. But to control this now, what we can do, if I go to modifiers and then control modifiers, I can get something called an XP scale. And let's go to the object tab for XP scale. And the parameter to change the particle radius, it is correct. Now, we can choose from different operations here. Just to see how it works, we can do set value, say 5. And then all the particles are going to be 5, like so. But the operation I want to use is this one, change value over time relative. And relative is referring to, it's going to change equal amount of percentage for each particle regardless of its size. So regardless of the size, it's going to increase by the radius percentage. And I'm going to set that up to 25 so it increases a little quicker. And I want to clamp this between 0.1 and 5. And then I want to make sure I clamp within range. I want to make sure that I check that. So now they're going to be between 0.1 and 5. Like so. And we can go perhaps into the emitter, to the emission. And let's increase the shot count to, say, 2,000. We're going to go much higher, and we're going to make a few changes to this. So, I mean, there you have it. So this could be the beginning, and then we could set up to drive this with fields. But I want to do something just a little bit more fancy. It's not really fancy, but it gives you somewhat more control over the look of the particles. I want to map the XP scale to a texture. So let me show you how we can do that. First of all, I actually want to see the actual letter. So let's go to the display tag and just tick off use for a second. And let's create a new material. I'm going to call this one Scale Matte and put it on the mode text. Got on the emitter instead. Let's do the mode text. And then let's go into the material. Let me pull that guy over. And let's take off reflectance. Now you could use color. I'm going to use the luminance in this case, but you could choose to use whichever color channel you want. I'm going to go into here. I'm going to add a noise. And then I'm going to keep everything as is, 65, 100. Let's just bring up the low clip a little bit. Say 20 or so, 18. And then I'm going to increase the contrast to around, say, 30, 35. That's good. Now let's just change the mapping of this so it doesn't look so horribly bad. Let's do a projection. I'm going to do cubic, although this doesn't really make that big of a difference later on because we're not using the texture in the normal sense. But let's set it to that so it doesn't look so ugly in the viewport. And let's go back to the scale modifier. And I want to go to mapping. And I'm going to click add. And the mapping feature is incredibly powerful in XParticles. You can map values to, well, all these things. You can map the size of this to the position, to the scene time, smoke, speed, all kinds of values. So this is incredibly useful. Now, the parameter that I want to map this to, if we go back to the object, we have lower radius limit and then we have upper radius limit. So I'm going to map the upper radius limit. So parameter is going to be upper radius limit, like so. Now, what do I want to map this to? I want to map this to a texture. Now we get a texture slot. Let's bring in that texture we made, like so. And I'm going to use sample position unique random in this case. But the channel right now is set to color, and we did set it up in the luminance, so let's switch that. And let's go back and enable our display tag so we can see this a little better. And then play it again. So now we get just a different spread. You can go in, you can play with this noise now to get a different spread of the particles from large to small and things like that. But to show this now, I need a lot more particles. I'm going to go back to XP emitter, and I'm going to do the shot count to 25,000. So now that I play this back, we're going to have a lot more particles. Like so. So it's starting to take shape. Now, one thing that I want to do at this point is I want to have them interact with the cage just a little bit, just so we have a little bit of movement. And one way we can do that is if we go to the mode text, right click, go to XParticles tags, and then let's add an XP collider. And in the XP collider, the normals, I want to make sure I use the inside, because right now this is set to outside. Let's do inside. And then I don't want any bounce. I don't want any friction. I just want to leave it at 0, 0, 0. And now that I do that, you're going to see that the particles are just going to jitter. They're going to move just a little bit. It gives more life to this. Now, this is a matter of choice, and this is not always appropriate. But just a little bit of movement, I think it's pretty nice. Now, one thing that you're going to notice is that although this is a collider object, you're going to have some of these particles being outside. If you wanted to constrain them within this letter, you have to emit from a smaller object because they're emitting from this volume. So if you emit from a smaller object, you can have them contained within the bounds of this letter as well. But in this case, I'm not after that at all. I actually prefer when they are outside the shell just a little bit. So that's the beginning setup. Let's move on and have this one animate on rather than coming on right away. And that's when we're going to start using fields. So let's first go to the fields list, and I'm going to add a spherical field. If I could find you, there you are. And in the spherical field, I'm going to change the size to 37. Look at this from a different angle. And just going to remap this a little bit so the inner offset is around 60. 61 is good. And now I want to have this field travel on the spline that we drew before. And an easy way to do that is if I right-click on the spherical field, animation tags, and say align to spline. And then I just need to drag in the destination spline. And that's the one we drew before. So let's do that spline. And I'm also going to move the spherical field to the bottom. So now, if I go back to the line to spline here, I can now drag my position. And if the movement is in the wrong direction, if you started drawing from the top here, going around the C this way, then you can reverse this order. If you go to the spline, go to spline, and then point order, you can reverse the segment, and that would reverse the way that this is traveling. It would reverse the order of the points, and that would, in turn, change the order or the direction of the spherical field traveling. I got a little jumbled, but I think you understand the point. So let's set some keyframes. I'm going to go to frame 0 and do position of 0. Go to 180 and bring this to 100 and set a keyframe. And I want these to be linear, so I'm going to right-click on the word position, animation, and then show track. And I just want to make sure that this is set to linear, so we don't have an ease in and ease out. And if I play this back now, it's not going to do anything yet because we haven't specified that we want to use fields, of course. So let's do that next. If I go to my XP scale, and I can go to the fall off tab, and then I can simply just drag the spherical field in here. And just by default, it's going to work. So you can see that now we have it riding on. We have some jitter going on here at the same time, and it looks kind of nice. I'm going to add one more thing to this, and this is strictly optional, but I'm going to add another noise to the transition area. So it's just a little less regular. This is a small tweak, but it's a good technique. So let's do it. I'm going to go to the fields list again and bring in a shader field. Pull that to the bottom. And in the shader field, let's add a noise again. And let's go into the noise. Pull this up so we can see a little better. And I'm going to keep it at a standard noise. Now the space, I'm going to change this from texture to world. So just imagine this object being surrounded by a big field of noise. And I'm going to make it a lot bigger. So 600. And then I'm going to bring up the contrast a lot. So around 75 or so. 74 is good. So now to use this shader field, we need to go back into the XP scale and to the fall off. And you can see by default it was added. If not, just drag it in there. If I set it to normal now, it came in as max. But if I set this to normal and play this back, you can see that it doesn't do what we want, but it does have a very interesting effect. It cuts holes with the noise here. And this could be really useful if you had, say, a volume filled with particles, and then you just set this type of noise to cut holes in it. Could be a really interesting look. Now, in my case, I don't want to do that. I just want to have the transition area being affected by this noise. But if you wanted to, let's set this to multiply. Let me just show you what that would look like. So if you would set this to multiply, then you could have this confined to the C, and you would have these holes in the letter. And that could be really useful in many cases. But again, that's not what I'm going for this time, but that could be really useful. But if you set this to overlay, and that means it's now just going to be affected in the transition areas, like so. So we have a slightly more irregular transition area there. And let's stop up here. So now this is how we set up the particles. And the next phase is going to be to render this. And I'm going to use Cycles 4D as the render engine. To be able to render the particles, I need to go to my XP emitter. I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to Cycles 4D tags and do a cycle instance so we can render this. And let me just create the material now. I'm going to do Cycles 4D, just an object material, and put that on the XP emitter. So I'm just going to switch my layout to my Cycles 4D layout, and I'll be back. Well, actually, before I do that, let me just show you the other elements. So if I unhide them, I have a camera. It is a 50mm camera, and it's animated just ever so slightly. I would argue that it was too little. I would probably reanimate this one if this were a real job. And then I have two main softboxes, or just a key. This main softbox is this one, which is a very blue light. And then I have a softbox, a rim light here, which is kind of yellow. And I also have an environment set up with an HDRI. And I'm using Grayscale Gorilla's plugin here for HDRI Link because I have it and it's really handy and useful. But if you don't have it, just use any HDRI map that you have. And I think HDRI Haven is a really good place to start looking for HDRI maps, just as an example. So I'm going to select my camera, and then I'm going to twirl this up. And then let's go for the rendering. Okay, so here's the Cycles 4D layout. I have my node editor on the left side. The real-time preview window is in the center on the top. And then I have my attributes manager in the center column at the bottom. And then the standard perspective view and my objects manager is on the right side. So let's start this and see what we get. Okay, so we get the mode text. That's not what I want. So I'm just going to hide that. Well, there's our particles. So let's do this. I'm going to do just one material, but I have quite a few components to it. So let's do it in stages. Get as much space as we possibly can. So this first material, I am going to just make this one bluish, around, that's good, around 223 or so. Bring down the saturation to between 5 and 10 or so, and then have it around 20. So it's fairly dark, but it's not that dark. So that's the base material. And then let's just bring up the roughness a little bit. Let's do roughness 0.35. So that's good. And let's start working on the second material. So I'm going to go right click and do shader. And I'm going to do another principled shader. And I'm going to pipe that in right away. And let's see. This one, I'm going to have really dark, just around 5, 6 to 6. And I think that's good. I'm going to keep almost everything at its default, except I'm going to enable transmission. So we have a transparent material. And the IOR is set to 1.45. So what I want to do now is that this transmission material, I want to have an emission material combined with this. So we have the appearance of some sort of light radiating from the center of these. So I'm going to do this like this. I'm going to add an emission material. So shader, emission. And I'm going to increase the strength to 4. And I'm going to blend these together. So I'm going to use a mix shader. So shader, mix shader. And I'm going to put the transparent material in the top slot and then the emission at the bottom. And then I'm going to pipe this into the surface. It's going to look a little strange now, but it will look better soon. So now I want to control how these blend together with a Fresnel node. So I'm going to go right-click, input, and I'm going to do layer weight. And then we have a Fresnel option. And let's just move a little to this side. And between this Fresnel and the emission, I want to control the Fresnel with a color ramp. So let's go to color, or converter rather. Let's do a color ramp. And then let's pipe the Fresnel into this color ramp. And let's just take a look at this. If I solo the color ramps, just to see what we get. I'm going to go a little bit more aggressively this way on the color ramp. And even more, something like that, perhaps. Now, what I want is actually the opposite. So what we can do is, if I move this out of the way, I can get to color and then invert. And I can simply just take this color into that color and put that color into the emission color. In fact, that's not what I want to do at all. I want to put this color inside of the factor of the mix shader. So let's kill that connection. If I hold down Alt and just drag, it's going to kill that connection. So that's what I wanted. And then let's unsolo this color ramp as well. So now this Fresnel is controlling where the emission is showing up. And you can see that it's showing up in the middle now. And we can come back and control this later on. But let's get some colors in as well. So I'm going to right-click. And I am going to get a particle info. And I'm going to get another color ramp. So may get converter color ramp. Now I'm going to take the random from the particle info, plug that into the color ramp. And if I solo that, you can see what it's going to do. It's just going to give us some random colors now between black and white. So let's pipe that into the emission, and let's change from black to white. I'm going to use a preset. If I go to the color ramp and click Load Preset, I'm going to use Flame 3. And it's going to look a little strange, almost like a cartoon. But the colors that I'm interested in are going to be on the right side here. The blue and such, we're not going to see. So I'm going to make modifications to this later on. But as a starting point, these colors around here is what we're actually going to see. So now I want to blend between all of this. So we started with this really simple dark material here, or fairly dark material. And then we have this other material that has an emission and a transmission material combined. So now I want to combine these two. So let's get another shader, mix shader. And I'm going to pipe the first material that we made into the top slot and the second material to the bottom slot. And then I'm going to put this into the surface output. And now I want to drive this with this random again. And once more, I'm going to pipe this into a ramp. So I'm going to say converter color ramp. And then I'm going to take the random, put that in the factor. And then I'm going to take this color and I'm going to put that into the factor. So now this color ramp is controlling what material is showing up where. And instead of this smooth ramp, I'm going to right click and I'm going to do interpolation of all knots. And let's do step. Everything is going to disappear now. Wherever we have white at this moment, that's where we're going to get the shiny material. So like so. So now this slider is really a threshold slider for how much of those glowing particles that you want. If you go overboard, it's going to be too much, but perhaps somewhere around here. Obviously, this is all to taste at this point. You can choose to do anything that you want. And perhaps now is a good time to work on the colors a little bit. I would argue that I want to have a little bit more saturation, a little bit more brightness in this. And perhaps mix up the hues ever so slightly, things like that. But I'm gonna call that perfect. It's not perfect, but it's perfect for this. I just want to illustrate this, and now you can switch around as much as you want. Now remember, you can also go back to this color ramp to control the look of the particles. So if you want to have more of like a glowy look, you can bring this knot to the right side, and you can have more of this kind of glowy look. And if you want to have them more clamped, less glowy, let's drag this to the left. Be mindful, if you go too far, you're going to kill it. So somewhere in this range, I think is good. I think something like that. Now, of course, a lot of times the glowy part is better to add in post, but that is entirely up to you. Okay, so let's set up one final frame here with some better quality and bigger size. Let me bring this window over, and let's do a zoom of 100%. And I'm going to bring up samples to 22. And then I'm going to play this, and I'll be back once this has rendered out. Okay, so that's the final result. And we've been using the XP push apart modifier, which I think is going to be very useful in a ton of different projects. Just let me know in the comments if you think it's going to be useful to you or not. It certainly will be useful to me. And that brings this tutorial to an end. If you found some value, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next video. And all the project files are available on velocitypeak.com. I'll see you next time.